All right. Last video, we were talking about nested ifs. That would be what you see in front of you here. A nested if is just simply an if inside of another if. As you can see, this is inside this if. You see the little lines. They denote like where the hierarchy is. There's something we'll talk about later called scope, which is like how you define things and where you define things somewhat matter. But these lines show you kind of the scope and how everything is organized. If you wanted to describe it, notice how this line comes like all the way down to here. This if is one big box. And inside that box, you can put other ifs and other statements, and they're inside that box. That's usually how I kind of describe it. And you can kind of see that's how it's lined up. Now, later, when we get to more advanced stuff, where you define variables and stuff like that, these boxes are pretty important as to where you put things and how you can access them. So now we've got this kind of overlay here of nested. Let's talk about compound. I'm basically going to do the exact same thing we've got here, except with some compound ifs. Now, as far as programming goes, I usually tell people, whenever you're writing a program, there's always going to be multiple ways to do the same thing. And as you go throughout a programming class and get further and further in, those paths to get the same answer multiply multiple times over. That's why as you go through the class, it gets harder and harder to cheat. Early on, a lot of programs look the same because you only know one or two ways to do something. But as you go through the class, there's 3 ways to do this, 5 ways to do that, several ways to do this other thing. It gets harder and harder to have the exact same program as someone else. And I'll often have somebody come in and, I'll just copy that code and let's change this variable to numbers 1 and numbers 2, and I'll space this down or something so it looks a little different. No. The logic of a program is always the same, even if you do that. If I look at this and I say, well, there's a variable, it equals 10, there's a variable, it equals 10, then you print. Even if you space this stuff out quite a bit or something, or change some of the names, the way it works, the structure is still the same. That's why it gets a little harder and harder to cheat. Especially when there's, 50 different ways to do a particular program, and a couple of people do it exactly the same way with exactly the same steps. Now, let's see what this looks like as a compound if. So, compound ifs. So this right up here will be your nested ifs. And I'm just going to make the same if statements pretty much here. So if, let's see here, number 1 equals 10, and number 2 equals 20. This is a compound if. You would have and, let's make a little comment there. This means and this means or. That particular symbol may look a little different on your keyboard. It's right below the backspace key usually. You'll see 2 kind of little dots, usually with the backslash. Sometimes it looks like a line, but whenever you type it, it looks like a line here on the same key here. So, and means both sides of this and have to be true. Now, a common error people will have is, let's say, if number 1 has to be 10, or, number 2 has to be. I'm saying and because I'm checking 2 different things. But let's just say I wanted this to be this. So if number 1 could be 10 or 11, this is how you'd write this. And how oftentimes I see people write this is this. If number 1 is 10 or 11, this is not going to work right 9 times out of 10. On both sides of this, it has to be a true and false statement. So in this case, that's not a true and false statement. So what I need is the full statement on both sides. If number 1 equals 10, or number, in this case, let's say number 1 equals 11, right? You have to have that full thing on both sides. Now for what we're doing here, I want it to be just like the program that's up there. So number 2, and it's going to be and. And I think I've got the code right here. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. Now, same thing, else if. I've got this, right? Number 1 equals 10 and number 2 equals 20. Now I've got this else here. And if I want that same kind of setup, I'd have to do something like this. Number 1 equals 10 and number 2 does not equal, let's say, 20. That would kind of be the same way to do that. If I put an else here, I can't have any other statements after this. So in this case, I want to get kind of the same output. This is what I'd have to do, depending on how we're writing. I'm doing this very simplistically, but hopefully you kind of get what I'm doing here. This is 10 and 20, 10 and 20, 10 and 20. This would be 10 and anything else that's not 20. And this would be 10 and anything else that's not 20, not equal to, in this case. And then I do the same thing here. And I'm doing the same exact thing as before, so I can kind of copy and paste. And it's equals 11 and 20. Oh wait, I just copied that one there. So hang on a sec, let me undo that. I copied the wrong one. So I'm going to copy the first one. Write in an else and paste it. There we go. 11 and 20. I just changed that one little notation. There we go. And if I want this to be the same, it's going to be pretty much the same as this. This is where copying and pasting can be very helpful. And it doesn't really matter how I've got this kind of spaced out, but if that's 11 and not 20, and then I would say else. It's something else. So in if. So in this case, and I'm not putting the end ifs here because it's not actually the end of the if. I have these else ifs. And normally, just my personal preference is to keep it like this. But it doesn't really matter as far as the program is concerned. I usually just like it this way. I think it looks a little nicer. But the program could care less. I could do this and the program wouldn't care. So here we go. We've got roughly the same set of ifs and the same output as what we've got up here. Now if I run this, I should get the same thing twice. It's 10 and 20, it's 10 and 20. And if I change my numbers, and whatever that happens to be, 11, let's say, I'll get the same thing. It's 11 and 20, it's 11 and 20. I didn't put my inline or /ins, but probably should do that, you know. I'll just go ahead and throw that in there. And if you wanted to do inline, you could. I mean, you get the same results. So there's not necessarily a correct way in this regard, but there we go. So run, and we get the same thing, as you can see. Oh, and just so you know, it is end L, not end 1, which I think some people have been confused about. So that's an L for inline. You wanted to use that instead. But there you go. These two do exactly the same thing. So the code for this and this are the same. Now, which would you prefer to use, or which would I prefer you to use? It doesn't matter. As long as the program does what it's supposed to do, you can write it however you want. Now, the tricky part here is sometimes you have to use a certain something. Sometimes you have to have nested ifs. You can't just pick one and just ignore the other. You have to know how to do both. Sometimes we have compound ifs, and inside compound ifs we need other ifs. you need nested compound ifs. So it depends on the program. Now I can have as many of these statements as I want. I can say and number equals 10 and number equals 20. I can add in another one and number 1 equals 11. Now this will never be true because it can't be both 10 and 11 at the same time. But if I were to say or and number 2 equals 20. What this is going to do is the and will connect these two statements together. Basically, it's this and that have to both be true. If one of them is false, it won't run. Then it'll check this one. If this fails, it'll go to the next one. If this one passes, it'll ignore this. So if this fails, it'll come over here, and the or will check the next set of statements, which is this and that. Number equals 11, and number 2 equals 20. If that's true, then it runs. So we can actually make this fairly lengthy and complicated if we really, really need to. But there you go. There's your quick little example of compound ifs. We'll see, of course, some more examples in some later programs, but this should give you a rough idea of how your basic nested ifs, compound ifs, and all of that kind of function together. If you have any questions or any comments, be sure to let me know.